Hello everyone, today we discuss a topic that many of you, as I know, like very much, that is the definitional, foundational, essential, character, especially in the early phase, of what we call, and as you know, there is all a huge parenthesis for those of you that don't know, the Byzantine Empire, culture, power, identity, etc. I will not be discussing today the vexata question of Byzantine-ness. I made, I think, 3 videos already, 2 hours and more long each, about the issue that exists. I will not use subjects, at least in this phrase, concerning this definition. Obviously, I'm not really new to the historiographical matter. I did my own share of Byzantine, history exams back in the day. That I always chose whenever I could. You know that Schwerpunkt seems to have developed mostly in at least a confrontational, when not conflictual way with at least the hype that for some reason that can be ascribed both to the academia but pop culture as well, including video games and YouTube, etc., regarding this, regarding the Byzantine Empire as a whole. I actually love Byzantine history and I appreciate it, I think, as rarely is done, but there is one aspect that apparently triggers people more than much, aside from the general philosophy of history, that I have built over time, because I also passed through the phase, they weren't called Byzantines, they were really Romans, right? And that I will not, however, be, again, digressing again on today, because I made so much content that it seems like it's a topic worth an update of some sort, and it's not even, of course, today's topic in the first place, but at least for someone that expects this sort of introduction to in fact Byzantine history. I remember that the greatest experts in the world about Byzantine history still call themselves Byzantinists. There are departments of Byzantinistics. That's the only way that we conventionally use, and there is a very specific set also of massive macroscopical civilizational, cultural, historiographical, literary, linguistic reasons why we use the term Byzantine, and we don't say, yes, this was the Roman Empire, we all know, but that's the why we actually call them Byzantines is in many ways overwhelmingly more important, even from the sheer conventional aspect of the story. That is surely conventional, like it doesn't have a foundation in the actual times of the time, but still of enormous importance and meaning for our own culture, identity, and civilization, right? And whoever does not know the history of the term Byzantine, its historiography, and why it's actually a pretty effective one in its semantics, in its becoming, in the way it was settled in this way, I strongly advise to give a look to it, because it's in a serious way, through reading. This is why you should read a lot of books in the first place, at least at the beginning of your career, to have this general understanding of why that is the case, right? I give maximum 21 and a half years old to people who still come up saying, they were not Byzantines, they were Romans, right? And just also to automatons, even to someone like me that, aside from my actual professional sphere, that, as you know, I don't bring willingly into into the arena here, but has made at least, I think, I don't know how many hundreds of videos on Byzantine history, and you may want to have the suspicion it knows at least a tiny bit more than you, next to all the things that you may know about the Byzantine Empire, that if I didn't know for some chance, you may still want to be humble to recognize, right? Never, this is an advice for, correct people, never go to somebody claiming like that they say something without even knowing what their work is about. This is not about me. This is something I say out of academic politeness, right? I can't go to a professor on a conference, in a debate or whatever, and saying, look, I don't know who you are, I don't care, you're just an idiot because, I don't know, you use this word or you have this idea. That is not really, first of all, an intelligent thing to do, but it's also something stigmatized and bringing to the deserved level of ostracization in a scholarly environment, all right? But this is not, in fact, what I'm going to discuss, even though, again, I would like to. I confess it's one of those things that cause drama and, conflict and, deep existential reflections and, contrasted feelings and all this stuff. But in part can be answered through something that we will be saying today. Because for all the videos that I made on Byzantine history, of course, in order to justify this historiographical, say, chronological scanning, or whatever you want to enucleate Byzantine history like, you must give some foundational, in fact, some fundamentals at the end of the day, and explaining why we also talk about something as the Byzantine Empire. Today we really stick to Diocletian and Constantine to look, in fact, at the beginnings and why these times were very, very important already, in spite of all the changes that occurred in later centuries for cutting, right, severe with some aspects of the previous tradition that are not, of course, happening overnight. Like what you see under Diocletian and Constantine is just like a process that, as any other, had already been maturing from quite some time, and that, as we will see now, also used elements that were not new to the same Roman war, but that were, however, being combined and affirmed in ways that were really unprecedented. And also on the reasons, we can't really talk too much because you would have to explain like why the Roman Empire transformed at this point, discussing the other issue of was this a decline or whatever, which is something that, given my, at this point, a roof of 3 hours, at least for a single, say for a daily video, I will not digress on. But again, I have a massive Byzantine history playlist. You can check that out, finding all the stuff, the controversial stuff that you really want to hear. And we will keep discussing it anyway. I will. There is no way around it. I start feeling old because I realized that these topics were just like, extremely violent and, widespread and, battled over, like, I don't know, when I began Schwerpunkt, and that already at this point the temper of the world is slowly sliding towards some sort of passive reception, like what was happening, in fact, at this time in the empire, sort of towards autocracy, towards, superstition, towards the emptying of the individual forces, the exhaustion of standards, and all this stuff. So, in part, things do happen like this. This is a way you can even interpret certain phenomena, right? In many ways, and I will be approximating, the political administrative system of the Byzantine Empire in this first era started from the reforms enacted by Diocletian, who ruled between 284 and 305. I made 2 videos that are key to this. One is probably one about Diocletian's reforms. We will summarize them in shortly now. The other is actually one about the Byzantine agrarian system and how this had, in fact, been settled at this time, especially under Constantine, rather, and that sort of, together with the fact that, of course, we're talking a pre-industrial reality, it wouldn't change too much over time, but it had a specific system of land ownership and exploitation, does characterize the Byzantine era as well, right? So Diocletian, as you know, had this very, say, noble in many ways idea of an aim of stopping that process of integration of what had been classical antiquity. It's a big way of phrasing it. Of course, you could argue that Diocletian mostly was interested in safeguarding how the Roman state had sort of managed to last up to that point. It is true that there were important reforms under Augustus, to say the least, but also, and I say this because, in fact, we sort of underestimate certain emperors. Think about the monetary reforms of Nero, right? There was also one of the great Roman emperors. Like, people don't, like, I have this thing going on with some of my subscribers, for which I promised that I would talk more about the Julio-Claudians and about the Flavian historiography and the sort of damnatio memoriae that was done of the former, let's say, to make us see them as a bunch of degenerates, essentially. And that surely must be understood, like, in the perspective of the time, when you see that, after all, there is such a huge potential that the Roman Empire would maintain. Here there is the problem of defining also what is Roman, really, because, for example, when I make videos about the western half of the Roman Empire, I don't call it Byzantine history, right? We talk about mostly the eastern half, right? So at this point, remember that in spite of the Tetrarchy, that as a system of partition and succession, Diocletian had envisaged, like, the entire deal of this was that the empire was still only one. It was true both physically and metaphysically. There never was such a thing like multiple Roman empires, and it's in fact quite asinine to even call what we call the Byzantine Empire as Eastern Roman, because, you know, it was called Eastern Roman Empire. It was never called Eastern Roman Empire. It was never called like that. You know, the administrative repartitions were called like that. They weren't empires. They never existed. Like, the Eastern Roman Empire never existed, right? It was always, in that sense, the Roman Empire, and that's why, in order to distinguish it more simply from, say, a certain time, which evidently changes had happened at some point, including the loss of the West, but that's also not the whole story. I mean, the most important factor, we use the term Byzantine, right, just to still make a reference to the aforementioned issue, right? And the way Diocletian so, like, fit to maintain, like, the antiquity in this statal model was, however, still altering deeply its system. At least in part it was preserving it, but on the other hand was insisting, like, even harshening certain aspects of the same that were characterizing in many ways that sense of, in fact, Byzantine conservatism that would remain in many ways at the root of the same Byzantine identity, like the Roman identity proper. The state surely was one of these things, like the Roman state is the truly, among all the other various cultural, ethnic influences, what the Byzantine Empire inherits the most from the previous era, right? This would last a very long time. I'm sure I wanted to add something else, but I forgot. Yeah, will come out in the meanwhile. The alteration of the structure is, yes, this is the point, was entailing further statalization of the system. Up to that point, that had, say, we're coming out, as you know, of the 3rd century crisis. So there had been a bunch of emperors, especially from the so-called Illyrian provinces, that were actually Messians, in many ways, like even actually more Celtic in origin than Illyrian, had literally saved the empire, right? These peoples understood much more closely for different political, military, and social circumstances in those provinces that what was really at stake and how crucial they were in the process. And Diocletian sort of collects all this salvaged system and decides that, it had already begun to happen, but at this point there is the possibility of stabilizing it further, finally, in moments of overall, not peace, of course, but still, like, absence of radical threats, like, you know, the 4th century, there is actually until Adrianople, a phase of massive stability in many ways that in fact is hinged on the increase of subtle power, of bureaucracy, of all those characters that in many ways would sclerotize the Roman state to a point of solidity that was very expensive to last in the entirety of this enormous territory, but that in fact would constitute the pillars of what would have been the Byzantine Empire. This is not just about that. There were other reasons. You can't pick just this factor as, okay, well, it's because Diocletian's administrative bureaucratic from... No. But let's say that these sort of succeeded better in some parts of the empire where resources were distributed a particular way, that were more connections. Diocletian was not yet thinking, of course, of the shift of power radically to the east, like Constantine would envisage, but definitely were lots of things already going on regarding the importance of other great cities in the empire as administrative capitals. Rome would always be the holy city and the capital forever, right? Till the Vatican City nowadays, throughout all the history of all the world and the imperial essence of that. Christianly and non-Christianly. Remember that the Christian cult at this point is not even licit again. I mean, Diocletian is unleashing ferocious persecution of the Christians still. It's Constantine and the Edict of Milan in 313 that had already been issued as an edict of tolerance towards Christians by Galerius in the East, that Christianity becomes legal. It's only with the Edict of Thessalonica later on, at the end of the 4th century, in Theodosius, that Christianity becomes the official religion of the empire. So a lot was in becoming, for sure. We already saw, again, what Diocletian's reforms were about. The changes substantiated essentially on 5 points, we can say. So one that would be crucial for Byzantine identity was the autocratic character of the sovereign. In other words, the absolute power of the same. Now, I don't want to digress on a great deal of theological issues, but as we will see now, the concept of absolute power really entailed that the emperor was seen as a plenipotentiary of all things happening on earth. Right? This was not understood in a more mediated way, like stressing the worth of the sovereign just because of his deeds and the subtlety of the spiritual superiority in the affirmation over the world, like an Augustus would have never thought to be to present himself as the detainer of all power, right? Even if de facto he felt in the sense that yes, God had endowed him because of his merits, and by Caesar's intercession, fundamentally as the savior of the res publica, with the dominion of the Roman people, and so the one over the world. But this power had to be displayed in a way that, in fact, would be as simple as metaphysical, right? This thing existed. There was no need to stress the autocratic character of the ruler, to make gigantic statues of oneself, especially in front of the Romans. Things already at the time were different in places like Egypt, the East. There, Augustus had himself represented as Ra. There was no problem with that, really, as a pharaoh. But in the West, it could have not been the case. And in fact, what is, I think, extremely important to understand when you study, and that I haven't seen in pop culture being, in fact, portrayed accurately, that there is the sense that the Byzantines were just the cool guys of the situation because they had a big empire. On video games, they have the purple color. As a general theme, as of course, derived from the concept of the imperial purple. And more or less, there's this flattening in equation to at a cultural identity level. Like, they're just cool because they're powerful. And not realizing that Romanity, in many ways, even though it had been running towards that level of autocratization, would not leave the same trace or spirit or nature in the West, right? We have observed probably in the western half of the Roman Empire, that in spite of the autocratization of power that occurred also there, and also during the rest of the early Middle Ages, of course, there is a more autocratic power, there is a monarchic orientation, and say we have an idea, of course, of how difficult it was to recover the idea of a people that would individually be so up to the standard being considered, say, with that level of individual autonomy and liberty, right, to be truly like a capable self-governing, in other words. And we have to wait for a millennium and a half before seeing that, right? There wasn't, right, in the Latin West, the same habituation to autocracy that existed in the East, right? And a good reason, I think, that that explains the essential loss of the West is not much the arrival of the bad, ugly, and terrible Germanic barbarians that actually arrived also in a pretty disastrous situation, like also themselves like suffering of the collapse of the system. The Roman system collapsing was a major, like, it brought down everybody with them, like including those who were trying to profit from it, and that actually, in the case of the Germans, wanted actually to preserve most of it under their control, and brought to a sort of rebellion to the same concept of Byzantine autocracy that was unknown even to the same Romans of Italy, for example. And I made a video about this, looking at the Ostrogothic sieges of Rome and the Latin Gothic ties against the Byzantines, which is an aspect that, again, is not very much stressed, because the idea is these were Romans indiscriminately, right? Because the idea is that the empire is not like conceived as literally a people regionally, nationally meant that has managed to elevate themselves over other people. Like, the message that has been conveyed to you, unfortunately, in the last generations through a lot of garbage, pseudo-history, is that this was sort of a blended, indiscriminately multicultural empire where everything had been flattened down to no backbone or whatever. And essentially, if we look at the Western Romans or the Eastern Romans, you're just looking at an equal half of the cake cut in between, right? One another. There are radical divides between the eastern part and the western part of the empire. Yes, sure, there is a common Mediterranean level of development, civilizationally speaking, but again, the Hellenic world is very different from the Latin world, as it's also very different from, say, the Syrian world, the Egyptian world, and the peoples that come to interact, in fact, with these houses are also different in many ways. The West will not know that level, for example, of steppe influence in autocracy, which is something that eventually would remain in Eastern Europe, if you think about that, and that sort of the Byzantine sorts of absorbed had absorbed in turn from the Persians, a big deal. Surely, like by the 7th century, there was a massive Persian level of autocracy, as much as the Persians themselves had acquired a lot of Romanity from in their symbolism, but also the relentless steppes, people's avalanches that would reverse on Constantinople would, even because of the sheer emergential condition, had to make this empire much more autocratic in many ways. In other words, if certain governments do not become vicious and aggressive, at the moment they can't maintain control on this territory, except this is something that gradually sclerotizes the system, because it takes away the potential, the act that is in potential in the people, and eventually makes things collapse. Like the West boomed in Middle Ages and the Byzantine Empire essentially faded away. And this is like a history that, from a Western perspective, that should be much more appreciated also when we come to talk about the Roman Empire, because unfortunately, again, the dichotomy is always like the Roman Empire is a huge blob, and then all the rest of different peoples outside, whereas pretty much things were, of course, different by different dynamics. There was also a level of homogeneity, of course, within the Roman Empire for certain things, but mostly was incredibly different within the same, and especially between the Latin and the Hellenic part of the empire. But as we were reflecting on these 5 points, so first of all, the sovereign's absolute power. Then the aforementioned centralization and bureaucratization of the administrative apparatus. In the previous centuries, before the 3rd century crisis, there hadn't really been a need for the Roman Empire to transform into a massive bureaucratic machine, like with permanent structures or whatever. What we think also of the might of the Roman military was mostly sustained from a sheer sense of willpower, of ethnic cohesion, of moral superiority, and sheer brutality of the military, than in a deterrent form than any sort of, okay, these guys are purely maintained by a state, they're so dependent, whatever. The Roman Empire hadn't even had, let's be honest about it, any major threat, like before the 3rd century, before the Sasanians and the confederacies that the Germans had sort of finally created in a functionally offensive way, right? And still at this point, Rome is by far, but I mean I stress by far, the most powerful polity existing in the western half of Eurasia. Like the Persians, especially at this point, are nothing really that overwhelmingly threatening. In fact, at some point when the empire has lost the western part, like and the Sasanians have expanded quite much, and we're talking about the second half of the 6th, the first half of the 7th century, like really become threatening at a point. So in many ways, also the concept of crisis is overrated, as you know, for these times in particular. Like the 4th century, again, is up to the very last decades. It's a moment of, again, severe stability compared to, what had been the third, even part of the 3rd century. Because let's be honest, the 3rd century crisis was not also something massive or so groundbreaking as we imagine. Right, it's something that takes time before kicking in, before first setting in and sort of obliging also the government to take this more autocratic measures. It is true that populations have started being flattened in their own what had been a functionally internal competition and level of cooptation. Everybody's Roman in a legal sense, or almost. And surely the 3rd century crisis has, mostly from a moral point of view, shocked the world, because, this was the great empire that had literally conquered the entire universe. How is it possible that there was a crisis? And the system is so big that you can't just get over it, right? The major ethnic spring has been sort of dried up, at least they have gentrified something up, and they're sort of abandoning, but they don't see the point. They have also, like in our society today, like living in this permanently stable system, and you don't even understand what it takes to hold it. Again, and well, in all this, still, again, the Roman military is top-notch. The imperial government manages to achieve these gigantic reforms that do actually succeed. Diocletian and Constantine are attributed normally with different side of the story. You see, Diocletian mostly with the administrative and social side of the story, and Constantine more with the military and the, say, monetary one, at least in the final affirmation of the soldiers, as Diocletian, as you know, had tried to keep the denarius up, even though it was brutally devaluated and keeping to devaluate. But it's more just like a broader transformation. We're not even sure technically whether these reforms were implemented by the the sheer conviction of these sovereigns, or just was their government that helped them, their ministries, etc. The idea, however, is that there is really a new and actually very functional reorganization of the system at this point that would bring to particular outcomes that in part stemmed current problems, in others like sort of decided to simply actually facilitate them, so to make certain specific parts of the system dying out and replacing them with others. And it's very complex for us to even understand what concretely happened, because we do not have, first and foremost, like the measure of the moral forces involved, or at least you can grasp them once you really get into the very depths of this culture through literature and sort of symbolism and more. And especially, we do not understand, like we do not have very solid figures regarding population, like demographics, literally, like also how the state really worked. There are some sort of historiographical theories, but these are not periods that you can simply understand by, okay, we will make a Soviet way to history and try to understand the hard measures and numbers and reality. That does not exist. Like history, if you start from that, you have already lost as a civilization. That's why I use Soviet as a term, by the way. And it was never a civilization to begin with. But in many ways, also because it is really a matter of moral forces. Like, it's not that the system was particularly frail or you can simply set some foundations that will go by itself, right? You must make the system work on the basis of the decisive moral majority that you can handle, right? And the subjects are becoming, in many ways, the problem. This the second point, centralization and bureaucratization of the administrative apparatus. Then the reforms of the taxation system. Remember, we're talking Diocletian still, just. So taxes become heavier, more concentrated, because they had to sustain this enhanced bureaucracy level, centralize also arms and armor production, etc. And in fact, the army is also reformed under Diocletian in part, and in any case, also the succession to the throne. So remember that these emperors are very, very much connected, more than before, to their own comitatus, to their own capitals, those bases of power that quite strategically conceive these as true warlords, like leaders of soldiers first and foremost, right? And facilitates also the itinerancy of the court, like the changes in the exchange, also in the tetrarchy of the various capitals and so on. As you know, a lot of this stuff does not really work, and it will not, right? So that it will be surpassed in Constantinian times, but Diocletian tries. So the consequences of this enormous effort, by the way, that Diocletian put, like also to an importantly successful extent, are that the emperor, and I insist really on this because the Roman Empire was founded, in fact, on that imperial divine medium, a dominus, right? This is definitely in line with the Eastern temper. This is, as we recalled before, an extremely different figure from the primus inter pares, as the emperor had been conceived in an older time. There had already been symptoms of Hellenization. The Proskynesis had appeared or read in certain circumstances. There was an ever more sort of theocratic sense of divine power. This would be mitigated by the Christianization of the saint, because otherwise it would have taken on the character of a true. At some point, it could become even a messianic figure in itself, because the hero, it's something that you can't find, for example, also in the Persian tradition, that eventually lives on also in Shia Islam, right, regarding this almost like properly messianic character of the same earthly ruler. But in that case, Islam remains in fact anchored to the idea that the same leader, at least of the caliphate, would have to be concentrating both the lay and the spiritual power. Right, Islam did not have a church, and this gave an enormous problem to the entire system. It in fact remained radically more unstable than anything we had in the West, exactly because everybody was accusing one another of usurping God's power, whereas in the West it was always a very clear double-threaded view, and training literally in confrontation with what the moral standards of the ruler should be fixed like, but through a same unitary system. That is incredibly important also with the church, that does not belong to earth, but in this sense is always a necessary presence. In this sense, the Byzantine Empire at this point does display certain traits of sort of Oriental monarchy, in which the emperor is not much just like invested of a particular office by God, but through the Roman people and his own Romanity. In that sense, of course, the emperors had always thought to descend from Jupiter, also because technically everybody does. But as you know, the Julian dynasty especially was strictly, like genealogically speaking, they came straight from Jupiter. Not much from Venus, because Venus, or even if you look at Aeneas' ancestry, he actually descends from God. Like if you go back in time, you do realize that at some point that the last hero or king was actually Jupiter's, in that case Zeus, because they belong to the Hellenic mythology in a way, about sun, right? But this, let's say the traditional imperial figure had to simply display this power without needing to enforce, needing to accept any real recognition of this divine power, just being, right? This was incredibly important. We have seen it in many videos about not just the archaic Roman religion, but how it was still alive in that sense in Augustan times. They were at that point already monarchic in nature, right? There had been a tendency during the 3rd century, because many emperors had not been so much from, in fact, the Italian background, that anymore, right? And the Diocletian would assimilate this sort of, leaving divine status, right? Pretending to be literally Dominus et Deus at the same time, therefore requiring everybody to really recognize him as such, right? Having himself called Jovius, that is Jupiter's son. This in Augustan times would have been unsaid. Everybody knew that. Everybody was sort of gazed at by this, and would feel it, would perceive it in the true spiritual essence, in this sort of metaphysical manifestation. But nobody could, because if they had done that, they would have admitted not to be Jupiter's son, to be called like that, to have others by law, recognize him in this way. And this is also what the same Christianity criticizes of this regime, that is becoming ever more sort of self-absorbed in the essence of power in an empire that, yes, may be enormously powerful, but that has evident problems of succession, of stability to some extent. It had not been all this enormous tetrarchic order settled by this enormous figure of Diocletian, is shaken, is falling apart while Diocletian is still alive. So the perception of victory of the imperium and the worthiness of owning it in this system is very, very fragile. It's very weak. It doesn't give anybody the actual confidence that the system is simply gonna be around without other problems, so much so that the Tetrarchy disgregates in an incredibly violent way with a new cycle of civil wars. And so that had been back in the day. Think about with the Augustan restoration, the end of the civil wars, like the point, like no more war, especially among the same Romans that must have just committed a terrible sin if they, as the chosen people by God, are actually shedding each other's blood and making their enemies stronger in the process. Also in the exterior forms, Diocletian insisted on this detachment from the subjects as well. Like, politically speaking, this meant that fewer and fewer people were actually involved in the decisional process, in the government of the state. The monarch was subsuming all these rights fundamentally and running the thing in a very autocratic and mostly military fashion. Diocletian, as you know, lived in his own beautiful palaces. The most famous, the one of Split, where he also retreated himself when he wanted to observe from the external how things would work out, like a bit like a Sulla post litteram. There was this increased sense, of course, that people had not been enough themselves, and so that they were sort of not good for nothing, but still not in the condition to dictate any rule anymore, aside from these very strong men at the top. Diocletian would show himself rarely in public as well, so that was an increased detachment properly from the accessibility to the divine. Also in a governmental sense, the system was becoming ever more oligarchic. A particularity of these later centuries is the accessibility of manuscripts, right? Also iconographically speaking, in this previous century you've seen always sort of people reading or even writing manuscripts well laid out. You could see what they were writing themselves. At this point, books that already exist, by the way, not just the scrolls, right, are depicted, but they're closed. They're just to show off because they're all encrusted with precious stones belonging to the aristocracy, and this would overlap eventually also with Christianity. The Bible also presented like that, and this sort of knowledge would become enclosed just in the hands of the ruling class, and that had to be trusted by the rest of the population, not really having to give much explanations in this regard, more like a status symbol of power, of literacy, of greatness, of wisdom. That was surely obstanced in this regard, but also severed from the rest of the masses, which is that are becoming essentially colonists, right, working on somebody else's land, even if they are technically free and not having much liberty anymore, right? And also for like very spontaneous and functional reasons, as we will learn now. But the detachment of this elite from people makes them also more demanding of power recognition. When the emperor showed up, he would be clothed with sumptuous clothes, and he would actually demand and impose that the adoratio, better known in the Greek version as proskynesis, to be performed in front of him, right, to him properly. So this was like, it could have never been asked to, say, a first century AD Roman citizen. A Roman citizen does not kneel in front of anyone, and because he's part of this great stock that the emperor is, and it's just like the peak representation, but is all one with the people. The proskynesis, as you know, had been introduced from in the Hellenistic world from quite a long time. Alexander's as well. We'll have to talk about him and what was going on there. but as you know, was of Eastern matrix, was something owed to the Achaemenid king of kings and also to previous Middle Eastern rulers, that consisted in the prosternation in front of the emperor god. So this is not much the fact that rulers are not seen as gods, as, say, in theory we all are, right, to a different degree from the greater one. But in this sense, it was how people felt not to be able to withstand this power anymore, right? Not to simply participate in it. There would be a sense of, okay, this guy's protecting us because he's God, and so this superstitious attitude, it was not the best, really. This depended also on which, subject you really were, right? Not all Roman subjects at this point are some sort of weakly fearful peasants that cannot defend themselves. Actually, the empire still holds up pretty well, especially compared to the rest of the world. In any case, with the triumph of Christianity, the identification with divinity was discarded. Right, Diocletian in this sense was really defeated big time. So there was the more shaded concept of emperor elected by God, which was sort of also much more traditional, actually, for those who think that, Roman paganism was just, destroyed by Christianity. Actually, the Catholic tradition is exactly the same one of the two worlds, and Christianity was reinjecting, as I explained countless times in various and also dedicated videos to this topic, that sense of spiritual standard that was necessary to wield power on earth, especially if you were the emperor and the ruler, as it would become essentially of a Christian state. It already at this point was emerging with the end of Diocletian's persecution, especially Constantine's legalization of the cult, in much more friendly terms with constituted power, and actually a very cooperational and also complementary one. The Byzantine world would, however, maintain a degree of autocracy, with the emperor far above, also in virtue of his recognized divine election, above all the other mortals. And this is something you see also in the Orthodox world in a cultural sense of how this affected, but not much because of it in itself, but for how also the countries where this mentality spread, right, would sort of be apt to receive, right, a much more sort of oriental and step-like autocratic sort of a worldview, and so and that would remain actually the losers of the civilizational situation in historical insight. But surely, it's not much about the form, but how, of course, it's substantiated itself. There is no doubt that this sense of greatness was really embodied by enormous emperors like the Saint Diocletian or Constantine. So it's also a matter of standards, right? The Byzantine Empire lasted so long, it was so powerful, right? Intermittently in its own history, exactly because of this granitic foundation that had literally to maintain imperial level incredibly high standards in an incredibly vertical system that was evidently just to be balanced with an adequate level of control. Yet, right, all the much greater power that the system could maintain was in part eroded in the process. The various formal aspects that defined the new imperial figure would be preserved as also yet another foundational part of Byzantine identity. The sovereign of Constantinople for the entire millennium would be considered chosen by God, which was also not the novelty, really. Everybody would think that, like everybody who had divine power would have that. but especially in an institutional political sense, that this would make his powers, at least in theory, absolute. Which doesn't mean, of course, that the Byzantine emperors at any point of their history had literally an absolute power. Nobody really has. No polity, no government ever had anything like absolute power. But there were some definitely autocratic characters, such as remaining the supreme judge, right? The only legislator and protector of the church. Of course, commander-in-chief of the army, that's sort of the least innovative and sort of the most obvious thing in the first place. But all summed, right, this confers to the Byzantine emperor, if you want, an unprecedented level of power. As a representative, especially of God on earth, so Vicar of Christ, what in the Western tradition really the Pope is, right? And this Caesar-papistic element is yet another characteristic of the Byzantine rulers. They become object of a particular cult, right? The same emperor has this political and religious meaning. His person was considered sacred, and sacred everything that connected with him. His subjects were, for this reason, his own serfs, obliged to prostrate physically in front of him. Everybody had believed emperors to have a divine power that was literally like the one he would dispense to his subjects to rule the empire. At this point, the concept is different. It is about him, like, controlling everything, and the others just having to obey for some reason. And you understand that there is something morally imbalanced compared to the previous era. The Vicariate of Christ is particularly meaningful there because, as you know, in the West, the papacy would always remain a mitigating influence of Imperial Autocracy that, thank God for this, like we did never had in the West afterwards. And that really conferred, in fact, our culture that sense of respect for power, in as much as we want it to be better, right? This is another world. This is literally starting to fall into a very different direction, right? In part, it belongs to the Hellenistic world, to the Persian, to the Egyptian one, like people's habituated with kings, pharaohs, etc. So it's sort of easier to accept for the Eastern subjects that are already predisposed for it, right? There is especially an ambiguity when it comes to the church, right? In the East, the church would be subjected to the emperor. It would have its own autonomy, but it was not meant to tell the emperor what to do. They tried at some point, but they failed. Completely different story from the West. Reason for which, like, the Byzantine emperors would put even popes to death, would use incredible violence over the church. They would simply do whatever, like, also in the West, the emperors would have liked to do, simply, placing, like, the equivalent here is the Patriarch of Constantinople, like, just being the emperor's guy, or like having a possibility of, like, and just a historical precedent just to manipulate the church and do whatever they really wanted. In part, this stemmed from the fact that all this power concentration would be reflecting the same centrality that Constantinople would assume. The Byzantine Empire, by the High Middle Ages, basically has only one city, that is Constantinople. The other exception is Thessalonica, that tries to some kind of autonomization, but all the rest are towns that are subjected to this mega center that has the emperor, imperial palace, imperial army, the patriarchate, and so everything is concentrated in one. This is also the great legacy of Constantinople, if you think about this. But it is also a much more inwardly oriented system, as we will learn. This may be great when you have to defend, not so great when you have to expand, really. And you have especially to bring this mentality on peoples that are used to just not be run like that, right? So it's an incredibly fascinating, complicated, controversial topic. Again, I made lots of videos about Byzantine history as far as the intertwinement with the Western history now really means, and those explain really the degree of difference between this Eastern and Western world that had, again, been there from a very long time. It's not a thing starting with Diocletian or Constantine, right? The Greeks thought differently from the Romans, and now they were Roman themselves, but not much in the ethnic originary sense, at least of the Roman Italic Confederacy that had conquered these people, actually. So other huge topic that and it had remained in the West largely, right? So also with their own culture, and etc. Like if you look at, for example, at the Western senators compared to the Eastern ones, the ones of Rome versus the ones of Constantinople, the differences are very eloquent. The Romano-Italic aristocracy, I even made a video about that, is constituted by truly noble and overwhelmingly educated people that really embody that sense of, like, we literally descend from the originary gentes of Rome, right? And in all her greatness and her centrality and her holiness, there's a much less sort of modern and lay mentality right there, in sort of in the understanding of power, but still not oriented towards a central autocracy, but the value of this nobility, this aristocracy. The Constantinopolitan Senate is constituted largely, like, of course, by powerful people of worth, but mostly by some, figures that have risen through the ranks through some selection that basically has to make them mostly efficient administrators, skilled at that. They have a standard pack education with a minimal classical thing, like especially in a Greek sense, like the Odyssey, the Iliad, this kind of stuff, and they don't have to be more than much powerful. They're placed there by the emperor. There is no much of a trouble they have to make. They can be moved, manipulated. Also, the Senate will actually decline a big deal in Constantinople, but this is how it was created by Constantine. I also made a video about the Constantinian Senate, for that matter. As we were saying, administration was remarkably centralized to the end of strengthening the Imperial Authority itself. That had evidently been tested and challenged during the frequent revolts of the 3rd century. As you know, that period had witnessed probably a fragmentation of the same state, territorially speaking, the instability of imperial authority. Also, were these generals making coups, killing the former rulers, and yes, achieving actually some important military results, but then being killed in turn by their own troops that elected another guy. So this aspect had been particularly scary, like the fact that the provinces had started acting a bit on their own. So the peripheral autonomies were limited, and the antagonistic power of the Senate, as we were just saying, was further reduced, right? It was ever more subjected. And this is also a reason why Constantine would shift the capital from Rome to Constantinople, at least in an administrative sense. Rome was always anyway and unavoidably the capital of the universe, metaphysically speaking. But one of the reasons was also the fact that the Roman Senate was quite active, and as we've seen, quite self-aware and sort of influent and arrogant, and legitimately so. And so the more distant you were from them, also considering that there were, at this point, more important provinces. It's not that Italy wasn't. The notion is that Italy had lost any sort of importance. This is not really true. Actually, was the place from which the same Western Empire continued to exist. Like wherever there was a Western power, it was from obviously this was the most functionally intact province and just suited for that imperial direction, but there were, like, the East as a whole was sort of, and especially because of that easier control on the system and the greater amount of resources, sort of this most strategic choke points, the Silk Route, all, this were really important, like the Egyptian grain, right? That was something that favored, like, political recompaction in the East. Already, as we were saying, cities like Trier, Milan, Sirmium, Nicomedia, like, these had all been important centers that were already more functional, at least for the stationing of what was still an itinerant court/army, as in the 3rd century it had come to mature, while the Roman Senate was always there, still trying to have some control on the world with the adequate negotiation. So it's very interesting to see what Diocletian does, because actually he reforms the entire empire territorially, administratively speaking. He wants this to still be a single system, as it was sort of versed to be. I mean, if you look at the Mediterranean and the more Romanized provinces, this is definitely like a functional area to control in a unitary way. The Diocletian controls basically the entire state through a capillary net of functionaries. To this end, bureaucracy was considerably widened, as we've seen. The provinces increased, meaning that they were also smaller, passing from 50 to 100 in this emperor's time. All right, they had already sort of been shrinking in the previous generations, as you understand. There were new administrative circumscriptions that were known as dioceses, right? There were 12 under Diocletian. These would be important for literally the diocese, and especially the metropolitic ecclesiastical administration, also because they're revolved around the most important cities, and that's where also the earliest Christian communities had settled, and the center of power really was. These dioceses controlled at this point in Diocletian times, they had nothing to do with the Christian term, but that's how it ended up overlapping. They included more provinces, and under Constantine, the empire would be further divided into prefectures, so that each of them would contain more dioceses, and more dioceses, more provinces. We will have to make a video about this because it's a bit complicated, but at least to explain it when you get it, it's easier than it sounds. One must understand how, these districts were run in the first place, like which communities inhabit them, which officials, etc. But it is true that in practice, the administration complicated itself remarkably, and it especially took on a more hierarchical system that started from the central government that was sort of safe and sound in the Mediterranean hinterland, right, behind some very heavy fortification, some hundreds of kilometers inland from the frontier, well connected, supplied, and so on, and that arrived by degrees to the last ring of the chain, scattered all across the empire, that historically had been also the cornerstone of the empire proper, of Romanity, that is the city, in fact, so the outer stronghold that could hold out for a while, even if more autonomous and sort of out there, more dispersed. And this is why prefectures, dioceses, and provinces existed, because it was just like putting all different layers of control, right, on each other, and still hierarchically, so that these centers wouldn't simply escape. Like the Romans mostly didn't want this to happen, even locally. But it was possible for the powerful warlords and oligarchs, especially the same tetrarchs, the same Diocletian, mind to actually seize control locally more easily, and they would do so, as we were saying, during the civil wars in the following years. And by the way, the prefectures system within the eastern part of the empire stabilized towards the 4th century, forming two great administrative districts that were the prefecture of the east. It's something you see also in the Notizia Dignitatum, for example. This was constituted by 5 dioceses that included the territories stretching from Libya to the extreme eastern borders, and Thrace, that included in this sense the dioceses of Egypt, the East, Pontus, Asia, and Thrace. I made a video again about the Notizia Dignitatum exactly on these, about these territories. And then the prefecture of Illyricum, that is the diocese of Dacia and Macedonia. So Greece and the central part of the Balkan Peninsula. At the head of every prefecture, there was a Praetorian prefect, one of the highest imperial functionaries that, with Constantine, would actually lose the old military authority to maintain a wide series of competences in civil matters. Right? This is another hallmark of the period, like the separation of the civil and the military careers. Right? Back in the day, the Roman magistracies had both. Right? At this point, instead, the imperial power wants the full control in military matters, and just a bureaucracy working from an administrative point of view, so that things would not be hijacked by some local official in a military sense, and the emperors would maintain sort of a greater control over the armed forces. The Praetorian prefect of the East lived in Constantinople, by the way, which was yet another way to keep him under control. He had a higher rank than the Illyrian prefect that was also relatively close in the aforementioned Thessalonica, right? So places could be easily reached, like for the control of the entire empire from the same Constantinopolitan emperor. The dioceses were held instead by some vicari. Bear in mind that at this point the official language is properly and fully Latin, right? So even if the eastern part was more Elephonic, I don't know whether you can say it in English, because there were also many other people speaking different languages in the East. Still, the administration is Latin, right? That at this point was sort of the lingua franca as a whole. Everywhere, especially for the technicalities. I mean, everybody understood what a vicarius was also. If, it was one of the few Latin words that would actually speak on a regular basis. Now, at the head of the provinces, instead, there were functionaries with different qualifications. For example, these cities' government depended on the local municipal functionaries and by the councils. This is something we've seen for the provinces being normal. So in Hellenistic times and in the earlier Roman times, there is a series properly on the Roman provinces that also mostly covered some of the eastern ones. So it tells you how it had already been organized. The councils were known in Latin as the curiae, of which the more affluent citizens were members. And it had always been like that. They had always been run by local aristocracy. The dioceses would begin to disappear in a statal sense in the 6th century. and the system of the prefectures would be abolished in the following 7th. However, the principles of centralizations and bureaucratization that we have seen would remain actually some of the most courageous characteristics in the Byzantine administrative system. Even if this, again, in the following centuries, there would be a further exhaustion of local resources, so all this structure was also sort of useless to control because also the people were not going anywhere, and the system had been effectively concentrating enough power, probably in Constantinople and in other sort of specific, say, means of power that depended on it. It was useless just to pay all that money for a bureaucracy of a system that had also shrunk, right, to be fairly simpler, right, also less population, less resources, etc. So we haven't really covered much of the post-Justinian era. We will have to get there. The more time passes and the higher the chances in general for the upcoming topics. As we saw in the video about the Diocletian reforms, the system of taxation was enacted through the introduction of the annona. This was a landed canon in nature that, because of the enormous depreciation of the currency that had verified, especially during the 3rd century, would substitute the ancient tribute in money. The two systems had never sort of excluded one another, all right? But at this point, again, there is also less precious metals circulating, and the state wants to maintain also sort of a more treasurized control on the same, and therefore, like, this also corresponds actually to a lesser grip on the local territory, right? So that's how you have to have a military that periodically reinforce that sort of presence, mostly in a deterrent sense, just like having a more, again, autocratic sense of power, not just much a local contribution to the system, but just an overlord watching you. The new tax system was constituted by an annual cycle of imposition known as the indiction, based on the mechanism of the capitatio iugatio, that is the correspondence between the physical person, that is the caput, the head, and the appreciation of land, that was the iugum, a plot, right? And actually there was an interesting say algorithm for which there had to be a correspondence, let's say a complementarity of the caput and the iugum for the collection, which means, first of all, that the least populated areas had actually to work more to sort of compensate for the lesser degree of control on the land. This is particularly interesting for the frontier areas. And also there is a greater increase of the connection with the same land. Actually, most people cannot abandon their own district. They are framed under somebody's control, and they must also inherit their own condition, their own crafts, etc., so that the state knows in theory at every moment, like, who lives there, how many resources can be counted upon in that district, and so how these can be more dirigistically organized. This would also ensure some sort of the tribute payment, because actually it was very difficult to have an homogeneous tax pressure. The provinces historically had been working with sort of a discretion as far as that was concerned, even for everything. Even during the Christian persecutions. You don't have to imagine that Christians were persecuted everywhere in the empire because like of an edict, right? There were only some places where this happened, and the various provincial governors handled matters in the way they saw fit. At this point, the idea was that if you tax everybody uniformly, you have an administration that is able to control properly the people's mobility. It is easier because there is also less mobility in the first place. Most of these people are under some landowner to work on his land as a form of protection, even from external threats, etc. You can be certain, right, more scientifically and concretely about how much you can collect from these various districts each, right? And it's a way properly to frame society into a mindset, into an order, into a system of obedience and control. In the Byzantine, so in the eastern part, let's say, of the empire, the monetary economy would end up actually resuming like the upper hand already towards the end of the 3rd century, and to this we have to add as the stabilizing factor also by Constantine the first of the new golden currency, like the solidus in Greek nomisma, that would remain at that point like actually favoring enormously the elite, which Diocletian had tried to prevent because he still believed in the citizenry, soldiery, and that instead would at that point give way to an oligarchic rule that had essentially paid in solidi and large amounts of, say, for large purchasing, and that would remain at the root, right, of the monetary system of the Byzantine Empire forever, right? So this is one of the greatest changes. We will explain better in other videos how, of course, this the solidity favored enormously the landowners, and how the system would stabilize in a more aristocratic direction also because of this monetary reforms. The military reform instead had, as we've seen, already been started by Diocletian, was perfected by Constantine. I made multiple videos about the late Roman army that, especially in the 4th century, is essentially the most effective Roman army like of antiquity in terms of offensive and defensive tactical capacity, the strongest in antiquity. All right, this can be debatable, but like the Constantinian army was an incredible thing. This definitely does correspond to an increase in quality, like in that, as we've seen, effort to organize in an ever more doctrinal and sort of, positively, let's say, desired fashion. Also, the functioning of the military. Of course, this system had already been evolving from the challenges of the 3rd century, was fully sanctioned and, let's say, employed at this point. And, of course, this also corresponds to like a subdivision of the various roles. As you know, that there are the comitatenses and the limitanae. There are lots of overlaps. We're not going to discuss this because it was part of a system, not just, let's say, the tactical one that could substantiate itself in field armies that were not so large and available as they had been before, right? So that's actually the other side of the coin, admittedly. As we've seen, the fundamental principle consisted in the separation of military and civilian, let's say, authority. This would be essentially introduced everywhere except for the frontier provinces, where, of course, there was greater threat, so they couldn't wait for, say, the two sides to just, say, agree with one another. There, the local governor had also to command the local forces that, however, not the field arm. At least in certain circumstances, things could vary, but the idea was that like the field army had to intervene in case of a regional threat, so the local forces were used at best to defend, right? Not strategically, not to offend in the same way. The army had already been divided in smaller units, also to avoid the excessive power concentration in the hands of a single commander. Consequently, this was seen as a way to stop the attempts of usurpation, but this wouldn't actually work either, like as politics goes beyond that in practice. It was, let's say, like in part it did work, but as you know, there would be lots of civil wars during this period as well. The new military organization, to which Constantine especially seems to have given a strong impulse, contemplated, as we were saying before, essentially the subdivision between the frontier army, the limitanei or ripenses, and the field one, like the campaign one, quartered in depth, to get, say, close to the centers of power. So the comitatenses or palatini. We will see about all these. We've made already something about the limitanei. We have to look more at the field army proper. So in part, strategy, say at least the strategic principle behind that was changing. Like, say in the previous centuries, the force of all the defensive system was deployed along the frontiers. This depended also on the nature of the enemies and what the army had to do. At this point, the Roman army is not projected to like simply project itself outwards as much as they could. The early imperial army strategically made a video about this. That's why the army was literally on the borders. Even if it doesn't make too much sense to consider them in that way, the Romans controlled also the peoples that were outside the borders with their presence, and they controlled also the ones inside that, as we were saying before, were not just, staying there for obedient for no reason, right? Except, say, the various conveniences of the Roman rule, but also a lot of deterrent force to, dissuade from doing anything dumb, especially during the process of Romanization. The notion that the former strategy would have been a failure is incorrect. Like, there was never like a situation in which, I don't know, some people broke through and there weren't reserves to send at them. If anything, it was the Roman system that was mostly fighting within itself, and other people sort of took advantage of it, and more or less the entire Luthvakian idea of the defense in depth as a sort of innovative thing or a radical strategic change is not there, right? Defense had always been in depth and would remain it, right? It's just like a matter of moral force. Now the Romans are sort of, more concentrated on the essentials. They have overall less resources, or at least the ones they have are more precious, and so they are trying to minimize, even at the expense of some, in fact, expendable out there in the frontier, that is becoming sort of also an ever more different, let's say, some areas are going depopulated, there have been raids, some areas have historically been less Romanized, right? And the Romans were also not particularly interested in that. They would prefer to settle barbarians there. Today we do not look at it, but still the empire would go on with the same practice of crushing one people, and instead, especially at this point, instead of slaughtering them, resettling them and transforming them into Roman colonists or recruits, which did work clamorously well, by the way, until the internal force was not enough to withstand, especially the massive pressure that was triggered essentially by the Hunnic migration/invasion. And in fact, if you look at this reform, like, you can't see even a radical change overall. There had already been transformations during the 3rd century, even the late Second, we tend to see in a too fixed way, like the early imperial army and the later one. Like the army had always been changing and always adapting to the various challenges effectively, by the way. The beginnings of this also show an important quality of the frontier forces as well. Just over time, the frontier army would end up being considered of second category and lost efficiency. Like everything was deteriorating. There were other peoples from the outer side pushed over the frontier, and they were sort of more militarized than the local militias existing there. So even if there were actually like top-notch Roman units at a local level, they were sort of scattered, not making up the majority of the whole. And some of these forces would end up, as we've seen in some videos, actually joining the same Germanic rule, right? And remaining credited and revered within that system as Roman units for generations after they sort of blended in the rest of the system that underwent a cyclical crisis. However, this separation between, say, the frontier and the field army remained until the 7th century. That, as you know, especially with Islamic invasions, like witnessed the collapse of the empire. So they lost like half of their territory, and there had to be a radical decentralization of also regions that had historically been sort of the core of the empire. We're talking about the establishment of the themes in this further autonomistic sense, with a local army fostered by, say, the local administrators and establishment that had to also be out there on its own, because very often at that point also Constantinople itself was under threat, the darkest hour in Byzantine history, except the end, or 1204. Now, the last structural intervention of important scale was enacted by introducing through the Tetrarchy a rule for the succession to the throne that could obviate to the chronic instability of central power. Right, the Roman Empire had up to that point been founded on the political and institutional basis that Augustus had given to it. Like literally until Diocletian, the system held clamorously. It was arguably the greatest political success in the history of mankind, just by the religious universal implications of it all. Only one thing, the Romans, exactly because of that initial lack of sort of monarchic and dynastic mentality of autocracy and sort of recognized tyranny, if you want, had never worked and had actually created lots of problems for the empire. That was the succession system. There was no such a thing like a formalized succession system. Diocletian tried with the Tetrarchy. It's very famous in its functioning. In theory, it had to reflect the imperial ecumenic perfection of divinity, of sheer will. Instead, it failed clamorously, and so that's why there was all a criticism to this. There were two elderly emperors, the Augusti, that had to be succeeded automatically by two Caesars chosen by them, and the two new Augusti had to in turn choose their own next Caesars, respectively, to ensure that continuity. Diocletian enacted this in 305, so that's when he literally renounced solemnly to his Augustan rank, also obliging his colleague Maximian to do the same, so that they could be substituted by Constantius, Chlorus, and Galerius. That in turn would co-opt as Caesars Maximinus Daia and Flavius Valerius Severus. You know these names because of how the story ended. once Diocletian passed away, this mechanism of transmission of the throne revealed itself a complete failure. It was soon dismissed. Constantine, as you know, reunited the entire system. He took over all the other literal force of the empire that this tetrarchic system entailed, territorially as well. And it survived in part, like in the first Byzantine period, only in that sort of emptied form, devoid of any substance, because the sovereigns in office were defined as Augusti, while their likely successors would receive, even though in a discontinuous way, the title of Caesar. And technically, this was already there since the early empire, right? But it was formalized later on, starting from the 7th century. The Caesar would end up losing this original meaning, and as we've seen in various Byzantine history videos, it transformed itself in a simple palatine dignity. You could be appointed Caesar if you were, I don't know, you married a princess or did something like that, even without any particular ambition of succession. It was just a great honor, but it also changed over the rest of Byzantine history. After Diocletian's Tetrarchy, by the way, there would never be like yet another attempt to define a succession for the throne. So the Byzantines didn't actually settle the matter. There was a problem inherent, like in this, they maintained a level, yet another important level of traditionalism, as far as the idea is that you were emperor just in virtue of force, right? Not of blood. Like blood could help and would. There are dynasties, as you know, in the Byzantine Empire, but these are never formalized in successory terms just per se. There was an idea of legitimacy, of blood continuity, but it depended on the particular political temper of the times. The Byzantine throne, as you know, was often contended with force by various claimants. And in conditions of legality, the supreme power was theoretically elective still, like as in theory the Senate should have appointed a new emperor. But in practice, in spite of some case of actual election, also in the period of late antiquity, since the beginning, there was this other system that is cooptation, right, for which the sovereign in office would associate to himself or one or more colleagues, from which also numerous dynasties, also lasting, starting from the age of Constantine, like would follow, right? And this was important because it left a degree of flexibility that at the end of the day was the other side of the coin, and would let's say help, like also choosing like temporarily, like a specific heir, and maybe taking him out in one or another. And the notion was that the Byzantine emperor, first of all, was the only emperor of the world, and he was the only one who could, in that sense, appoint another emperor in life. This is quite fascinating because aside from the fact that, as you know, there were multiple emperors later on with the administrative split, and so it's as if like the Imperium had passed through multiple people. Like this was done also later. Just the Byzantines would also maintain the idea that they were the only ones to have such prerogatives. So, for example, they would deny, as most people do still today, following their same legalistic and actually anti-traditional, anti-historical principle that the Romans would, of the earlier era, would have actually understood. Those who had actual power, right, especially if they were Christians, and that were, like in the case of the West, like think about Charlemagne, Otto I. So all people who had deserved the empire and that evidently wielded it, because it's always God that gives it to you, but that the Byzantines would not accept because they were not Roman in their view, even when elected by the Pope. And so there are lots of very interesting, levels here that, as I was saying in the beginning, we could engage into like in the future, and we surely will, hopefully, like if we continue like this. And there would be so much to tell. As you understand, even these changes are not strictly innovative, like it's like there hadn't ever been before, but altogether they take up a new form that would result in that crystallized system that we know better and define, in fact, as the Byzantine one in many ways. And this is not all. Like we haven't talked culture, we haven't talked so many other political reasons. This is just sort of an introduction to my playlist about Byzantine history. And overall, there is what else could we say here? Well, the thing I care about the most is observing how, in a sense, different parts of the empire were behaving in a different way, right? And how this should never be forgotten when we see, let's say, the rest of, especially in the early medieval times, like the evolution of this. Because from one side, people do not understand the extent to which the Roman Empire existed. It was not just a territorial thing. It wasn't just about borders on a map. Like Europe, the Mediterranean, beyond believed that the Roman Empire was still everywhere. Right? The Romano-Germanic kingdoms, to an extent, believed that they were participating that Romanity. At the same time, the Byzantines are not the only depositories of Romanity. In fact, because the Imperium is to be borne by those who really deserve that. And Rome is Rome, right? It sort of remains within the Byzantine Empire up to a certain point, and in theory still is, but as you know, it creates another Roman Empire in the West at a point. And there is the power of the Church. And there is the idea that, according to the Byzantines, Romanity is the entire Christendom, and or everything, also in a territorially legalistic sense, that had belonged to the empire territorially, which is also like the pragmatic version of, like, in theory, the entire world is the emperor, especially if he's called the Sebastocrator. He literally maintains this partially, even in Christian times, this idea that there is a divinity of his temporal power, which is very subtle, but it's something that the Westerners are much more careful with, at least not because in fact, this is the difference. The Westerners keep on believing that you get the empire when you're up to it, right? The Byzantines believe instead that you get the empire just because you are appointed Byzantine emperor, which is an incredibly different thing. And this is possibly, like I should have said at the beginning, the single most radical, overwhelming, macroscopic, impactful, metaphysical difference that exists, even within the churches, within how these political cultures go molded, right? And that's why it's one of those topics you would never stop discussing, because it's just so fascinating and necessary, right? Because if people today understood the difference, not much for the time, for what it means today, they would look at the world in a radically different fashion. This is the Imperial Catholic tradition. It was believed by everybody, even before Christianity. And it was literally the only thing everybody believed in. When you recover that and you start understanding what really matters in this sense, you also start having a completely different vision of history that is also accurate historically, because you don't really just invent it. Like it's what really existed in their blood, being, let's say, Catholicism is an existential status. It's not a matter of personal opinion, and one has to understand the value of salvation and how to attain it through God's all might, but it's all also connected with the spiritual standards. And so what does a title or a name really mean? All right, there were actual heresies stemming from these misunderstandings. And Byzantine history is so fascinating, I could make an entire video just about all these considerations, like what is that we actually, like what is that as a historian, like as an average guy, or a, as a Westerner, or a worker, like this literally means to me. Because there is really a lot of stuff into this and in the way of this transformation. There are entire channels dedicated to these topics, but I don't see much awareness really about the ecumenic significance of this, all in the traditional meaning. As I was saying at the beginning, you can't either study this this part of history simply pretending that there is some sort of mathematical equation to sort out, and it doesn't matter what historians say or scholars do. Like, this is, they find out and they want to sell you, right? Late antiquity has been packed, especially now they slowed a bit down, but it was, when I was at university, still, like, in terms of like push of publications, etc. Like, they overloaded you. Like the I suspect from the 90s to, well, through the first 2 decades of the third millennium, there was inexplicably traumatic amount of publications on Constantine, for example. That is okay until you understand that there are just so few sources that you can use about him, and that even if you want to look at archaeology or whatever, it's never like a much of a reliable or helpful problem solver, game changer, right? And that there are massive chunks, for example, of medieval history that also overall were much more dynamic, bigger systems, richer, more populated, that are full of sources, and that they're at the center of the Western world that nobody really gives a damn to. So you must ask yourself why there was that overly emphasis, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, over Byzantinistics, and why most of this was associated with multiculturalism, with this idea of sort of a stagnantly, but at the same time decadently, sort of multicultural society that looks so much like ours to some extent. Some things are worse actually in our world. Some are better, so that you don't accuse me of making, that once upon a time it was, Schwerpunkt reasons like old people. Yes, I do, like, even if I don't say it is the truth, but that's not my philosophy of history at all. Like, if you think that, it's wrong. And so they try to enforce us this sort of, oh my god, look, there's another word we didn't think it existed. It was about this kind of life. And needless to say, there hasn't been this overwhelming emphasis on the spiritual aspect connected with the military one, for example, or also the appreciation of Christianity as a continuity of the Catholic tradition. It also sort of followed the categoristic patterns started from 1960s, 1970s structuralistic, socialistic historiography. And I think only now we can start rethinking really what those times were, if historical education hadn't literally sunk, like people hadn't enormous mental problems, and like the rest of the world wasn't totally crazy. And so at all levels, in all countries, in all cultures, like with a very specific hierarchy of those who were still actually underdeveloped savages, let's be honest, in factual terms, as I think everyday's news already show. And it's difficult even to talk about this and being listened to. Not because it's anti sort of current, I don't believe in that, but because people are not interested in history, I suspect. Right? They just don't care. And so it's always a challenge, it's always complicated, and this is the reason why I make so many videos on the Byzantines as well, because every time you have to look at a different aspect, and at some point it's only adding all these various pieces that you thinking about them out loud that makes you realize one point, another, and what this whole thing really was. And Byzantine history is colossal, right? So if you realize the topics we covered today as the foundational moment, we're talking about massive historiographical issues, right? So hardly anything that you can digest overnight, or in that way simply falling into the nominalistic heresy of the Byzantines were Romans and then not knowing anything else about the entire Byzantine history manual, at least. And that's, unfortunately, not a meme. It's real. Like, these people do exist. I mean, it's not because I met them personally, but because I was one of them at some point, I must confess, like for a short amount of time. But you must pass through that too, because otherwise you wouldn't learn the thing. There are very specific reasons why you tend to start from that, like, or at least to arrive at that point in some specific time in your life. But it never stops just focusing on one specific thing. And I've seen, like, even just identity speaking, I've seen people literally wiring with the concept of, oh my god, now we'll look at Byzantine stuff on the internet, total war battles, or look at whatever, I don't know what there is on Byzantine history in YouTube, but something still very superficial because it's Byzantine, and actually bailing out from the rest of the literal rest of the entire Western history, for example. Should make, like, there's surely some statistics, even from Google, you could derive that, how much people, or where they are from, and they get into Byzantine history without knowing literally even the ABC of their own English or French or whatever history of their own country. Like, it's become a sort of counter, like it's the usual thing of the person who fails in his own civilization and so has to self-sabotage, not to be confronted with standards, and so rooting for something else, also a bit as a fantasy reality that never existed. That's typical of, science says, like a feminine mindset. Like, if you're very much into fiction, chances are, and not in reality in the sense of history, not the realistic view of history that is just, you crying because you want to be right about how things have to go also in the present, while you don't understand absolutely anything about that either. What's the point of fiction or distraction or escapism if you have reality, if you have actual history? Like, it's not that history is a guess, nor it ends. Like, the beauty of history is that the more you get into it, and the more you diversify the information, the pool, and the more intelligent you become, the more you're able to understand all the rest comparatively. And unfortunately, also many people who get into history, including scholars, etc., they just fossilize on one specific field, but narrowly, like shutting down to all the rest, and then you wonder how civilizational collapses happen, right? Because it's that fear, it's essentially cowardice, it's being a small-minded person, which is exactly the opposite of Alexander's megalopsychia, by the way. And if you know what Alexander was moved by, well, we can agree that that's very much out of the horizon of the common person, which makes you think about how worth that person actually is in the bigger picture. And yeah, history does follow these patterns as well. Once you understand that, you're in. But it's like getting on the other side. It's literally an initiation. It takes some time. It takes radically hard work. Not something you can do even listening to my videos. At least you can help how to do that. You can help yourself through this content, like to access that, but it's not a guarantee of success. Also, we all sort of fail to an extent, right? But there are levels, and those levels do matter. And it feels comfortable being somewhere on the ladder, right? It never ends, but the more you raise, the more you see things in perspective. So which is terrifying, I tell you, also as far as your current condition, even if you are sort of elevated, right? And it doesn't take to be much more elevated than the average person. It's not much something you can see as a great personal accomplishment, right? But at least you have some vantage coming with it. You must learn how to suffer. That's the first thing. In any case, then power comes. Then God does give you what you need. In any case, for today, on this sort of disturbingly metaphysical note, I love the adjective metaphysical, as you understand. I stop it here for today. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.